Excellent. So the project that I'm going to talk about today is about our state legislature, the Nevada State Legislature. And this is one tiny little part of a bigger project that we're working on, studying the effects of the unique composition of our legislature, which, as you probably know, became the first state legislature in American history to have more than 50% of the seats occupied by women. And so in this kind of first cut at a paper, we looked at the relationship between gender and patterns of sponsorship and co-sponsorship. But this is just kind of a little tiny slice of what we're going to be doing. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the data that we have and some of the ideas that we're thinking about pursuing as we move forward with this. So what you're looking at right here is the women of the 2019 Nevada legislature. And you might notice that there are a lot of them, especially given how small our state legislature is. And the way this project started, it started when, right after the election in 2019, I was the director of the Women's Research Institute at the time. And I got a message on Twitter from a woman in Pennsylvania who is a women in politics scholar. And she just said, hey, how's it going? So who's doing the study on the Nevada legislature? And I was like, oh, I guess we are. So that's what we did. And this is the result of that. So I'm going to start with this quote from Senator Ivana Kinsella and talking about how she experienced the dynamics in that 2019 legislative session. She said, the way that we made policy this session was different than we did last session. And it's not a scientific way to correlate that with the female majority, but I do think it is in part due to the female majority. You can't exclude the fact that we had a Democratic majority in both chambers with a Democratic governor. So that certainly changed the dynamic. But I really felt that there was more collaboration and more discussion, and the session felt different. So the project, as I said, started from Twitter. And pretty soon after that, we started to develop a strategy for gathering some information that we could use to sort of answer some interesting questions that we had about the effect of having a majority women legislature. And if the patterns that people studying these, like the behavior of legislators based on gender, if some of those patterns still held in a situation and in a context where women made up the majority in the legislature. So we started out by developing this mixed methods approach. And one of the pieces of this was we conducted a series of elite interviews with members of the 2019 Nevada legislature. And we had a really good response rate. We spoke to a couple of dozen members of the legislature, and we were able to get like hour-long research interviews with each of them, and got a whole bunch of information from that. And the other source of data that we have is this interesting system that we've been developing with Professor Zorn from Penn State, where we basically write a script and go into the archives of the legislature and sort of automatically pull out information about all of the bill draft resolutions. So these are like proposed legislation, and look to see who sponsored them, how far they got, and that sort of thing, right? So we have this, this kind of dual approach to gathering information. And then, of course, I probably don't have to say as much in this setting about the institutional context, because most of you probably live in Nevada, or at least somewhat familiar with our state government from your 101 class, I'm guessing. So maybe that was a long time ago. I don't know if you remember, but we have a very small legislature, and our legislature has term limits, which means that there tends to be more turnover in these positions, because you're not allowed to just keep getting reelected over and over and over again. And we also have this kind of this setup for a legislature that was sort of trendy at the time that we were developing our legislature and the time that the Nevada Constitution was written. It was trendy to have just part-time cheap legislatures, right? So our legislature only meets once every other year, and it is intended to be a part-time position, although, you know, it certainly does take a lot more than just what happens during the legislative session. And so this creates an interesting situation where we have a lot of turnover. So we're always having some new faces in the mix in the legislature. And also, because the legislative session is so tightly compressed and so much has to be fit into that small amount of time, we see a very bustling legislature. So has anybody been to the legislature during the legislative session? Like in the before times when we used to be able to go places, maybe? So if you have, you would probably have noticed that it is really, really busy, right? People are, you know, trying to get all of these bills through because the time is so limited. So we came up with a number of different research questions, and they all revolve around this kind of more central question. And that is, do existing patterns in legislative behavior continue when women are no longer in the minority, right? So we have seen in the past this sense that women as legislators tend to collaborate more. They tend to seek out bipartisan opportunities more. But some of the theories behind this were based on the fact that women were operating in these sort of male gendered institutions. And so they were sort of, these behaviors that were manifesting were really related to the fact that women tended to be tokens in the legislature. So we're asking, you know, does anything actually really shift once you have a majority of women in the legislature? So the data, we have information on legislative activity by every member of the Nevada legislature from the 75th legislature to the 81st regular legislative session. And so that's 2009 to 2021. But remember, that's one legislative session every other year. So it's 7 sessions with 168 different legislators. And there were about 3,200 bills introduced during that time. And so they would be sponsored by individual members of the legislature. And so we took these data from Legiscan and wrote this sort of web scraping tool that would go in and look for particular pieces of information and drop it into a database for us. And then the other part of this is the set of qualitative interviews we did with 25 members of the Nevada legislature. And these were all members of the 2019 legislature. And we conducted these interviews pretty much right after the legislative session, because the legislative session usually ends in like June. And our interviews were between August and October of 2019. We had 18 women, 2 of whom were Republicans, and 7 men, again, 2 of whom were Republicans. And we also had representatives from both chambers. We also had some interviewees who were brand new in the legislature and others who were part of leadership. So this is the data that we're working with. And so you can see here, this is a little chart about the gender breakdown of the Nevada legislature from 2001 to 2021. And so you can see that, 2019 is obviously a fairly big shift here. We move from right about 40% to a little bit above 50%. And you can see we've actually moved even farther in that direction now, where we had in the 2021 legislative session that is underway right now, we have 60% of the legislature is women. So you can see that if you're going all the way back to 2009 or so, that was about 30%, and it kind of moved around in that 30 to 35% range, up until the 2017 legislative session, where we hit 40%, and then 2019 where we hit above 50%. So while we spoke in our interviews with people who had been part of that 2019 legislative session, our data goes back to a time where Nevada's legislature, in terms of the gender makeup of the legislature, actually looked a lot more like most other state legislatures. So it's only in these last couple of sessions that we've started to see this sort of major increase, where women in the legislature are starting to become more than just sort of a small token group there. So we started off by kind of looking at some of the patterns in these kind of in terms of sponsorship and co-sponsorship over time. And so this first chart is it's actually between 2009 and 2021. I'm not sure why the label at the top says 2013. But basically what we're looking at here is we're looking at the number of bills that have a primary sponsor. And this is broken down by gender and by party. So you can see over time that the GOP lines tend to trend together, right? And then the Democratic lines, the blue lines, tend to kind of track together as well, right? So in 2019, you see this kind of interesting situation where you've got sort of the Democrats take control of the legislature, and they start being primary sponsors of fewer bills in that context. And then you see, so all of these are within a pretty tight cluster here in 2019. And then if you look at this is just the bills where there's a woman who is a primary sponsor of a bill, and this is over that same time period, right? And so you can say this is the proportion of bills with women as the primary sponsors over time. And so you can see it's probably not too surprising to see that you've got a bigger proportion of the bills coming from Democratic women as opposed to Republican women. And this is because it tends to be the case that in our legislature, more of the women there are Democrats than Republicans. Good. So this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. Here we're looking at the median co-sponsorship position by gender and party. And so basically what this means, when you're co-sponsoring one of these bills, the higher up your name is in the sponsorship list, the more the earlier on you've become involved in, the more the more tied to you that particular piece of legislation is. And so you can see here that as we get to 2019, again, you see these, the lines for the Democrats kind of track in a similar pattern, although women tend to have a higher median co-sponsorship position compared to men. And this also happens with the Republican members of the legislature as well. And this is the proportion of bipartisan bills by sponsor, gender, and party. So this is where we start investigating the question of bipartisanship, right? This idea that women are going to seek out more bipartisan legislation. And part of this, I think, will be tying to some of the research about the fact that women in a lot of state legislatures create their own sort of women's caucus. And these are bipartisan caucuses that are essentially for the purposes of women coming together across party lines to develop ideas and bills that they would be able to join in a bipartisan way. And so you can see here that that these bipartisan bills, you see the red dotted line is GOP women. You can see that the Republican women were actually sponsors of a whole lot of bipartisan bills, right? And this makes a little bit of sense when you consider the fact that when you're in the majority, and of course in 2019, the Democrats had a super majority, right? And when you're in the majority, you don't necessarily have to seek out bipartisan opportunities. But if you are in the minority, you have to find at least some people from across the aisle to support your legislation if you want it to have any sense of, any possibility of getting passed. And so that's why you'll see these like party trends where in terms of bipartisan bills, unless they are bills that are just intended to sort of be position taking for public consumption, if these are bills that the sponsors actually want to see passed, those who are in the minority have to try to get bipartisan support for their bills. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here with these, the sponsorship of these bipartisan bills. So we wanted to know a little bit more about bipartisanship and looking to see what the impact is of having women being the sponsor, and also which session this is in. So in this, this is a pretty simple regression analysis. The first one is a logistic regression, and the second one is about the degree of bipartisanship. And so that one is actually a regular ordinary least squares regression. So the first one is just looking at whether or not a bill was bipartisan in terms of sponsorship. And there you can see that, as the number of co-sponsors goes up, the likelihood that the bill is bipartisan is going to go up, right? Because there are more chances for it to be bipartisan. And then and then it's really difficult to actually interpret any of the rest of this, because these are all the rest of these are sort of contained in these various interaction terms. So we have some, I think we have some diagrams in here perhaps about what these look like. And then when you look at the degree of bipartisanship, you can see this is a measure that looks at, did I send around the copy of the paper? I think so. It has a little description of how this measure was calculated, but essentially it is about sort of whether there's just token bipartisanship or like kind of it's a scaled representation of the degree of bipartisanship. And there we can see that, all else equal, the degree of bipartisanship of a given bill was higher among women during the 81st session, which was the 2019 legislative session. So this gives us a sense that that it is women in the legislature driving this pattern of bipartisanship. And so, you know, the conclusion here is, I mean, we don't really conclude very much, because at this stage, we're really just starting to dig into some of the patterns in the data, and starting to get a sense of where we can go from here to answer some of the remaining questions about whether having a female majority is really impacting legislative behavior. But we do find that bipartisanship seems to be on the rise, especially among women legislators. And so there is a lot of research about the power of having bipartisan women's caucuses in state legislatures. And so we have one in Nevada. And so we're thinking that this might be related to what is actually happening in these women's caucuses. The interviews we conducted also suggest very strong norms toward bipartisanship in policymaking in Nevada. And this is obviously really different from what we see in the federal Congress, right? Where we very rarely these days see true bipartisanship. But in Nevada, we end up, usually we end up seeing this kind of strong party polarization only in those issue areas that are sort of nationalized. So things that are kind of replicating some of these bigger national political fights. So things like voting rights and stuff, right? That you would see some of these bills coming through a number of different state legislatures. Those kinds of bills tend to still be very polarized, but there is a lot of work that the state legislature does that doesn't really track directly onto these kind of nationalized issues. And so the norms toward bipartisanship are quite strong, and they don't seem to be terribly compromised at this moment. What we're looking to do, and I am actually going to, like, I have my notebook here and I am ready to get some input about what kinds of things you would want to know given the information that we have. You know, we're thinking of looking at co-sponsorship networks, using some network analysis to see if we can identify the movers and shakers in these processes, and also to scrape information from the full text of the bill, which we already have. We can use some sort of text analysis, computer-assisted text analysis, to pull out information about what's in these bills, how they're written, what kind of language they use, even how much of the text is actually changed from when the bill draft resolution is introduced through its maybe eventual passage. We're also going to be looking at legislative success. So we'll be doing what's called a hazard model or a survival model, where we look to see for each of these draft bills, which ones of them end up surviving, and how can we predict which ones end up surviving the legislative process and being approved by the legislature. And another thing that we're planning to look at will be this idea of women's issues. We asked a couple of questions about this in our interviews and got some really interesting information from the members of the legislature about how they view a women's issue and whether they thought that having a majority women in the legislature made a difference in getting policies on the books that were actually sort of central concern to women. And one of the things that I'm particularly looking forward to digging into on that topic is this idea that a lot of the women said it was a lot easier to start the discussion on some of these bills that like the Trust Nevada Women Act is one that was about access to reproductive health resources. And, a lot of the women said something to the effect of, it used to be in the olden days that we would have to spend the first part of the hearing just convincing people that this is the thing that actually matters to people, right? Because the majority of the people in the room weren't women. They might not have ever thought about, all of these different things that come into play and why. So the women tended to feel like they had to first defend that this was actually an issue worth the legislature's time, and then go on to debate the merits of the bill. And they said that, having that many women in the room made it so that they didn't have to spend so much time sort of just defending the idea that, men have been making the laws in this state for pretty much ever, and they missed a couple of things that women might notice that men didn't. And so, one thing I'm curious about looking forward, my kind of provisional hypothesis about this is that we'll probably see, in the first session or two with a female majority, we're likely to see more of these bills dealing with things that are traditionally women's issues. But that'll probably taper off after a while because, this group of people has a whole lot of history to fix up, right? So there were all of these years with, very few women in the legislature. And so once the kind of glaring problems in the law are fixed, then we might see those kinds of bills returning back down to a more kind of normal percentage of the things on the agenda. And then there's probably any number of other parts of this that we'll probably investigate. I know one thing we asked several questions about in our interviews was about sort of the culture and climate of the legislature, particularly as it relates to gender dynamics and harassment and that sort of thing. And we got a lot of interesting feedback about those questions. And so I'm hoping to be able to work on a paper about that maybe next on tap. So that is kind of where we are. It's relatively early on in the process, but I would love to hear your thoughts or questions. So thank you so much for having me.